It's time to make a new friend today. I've got somebody I've wanted to talk to for a long time on the podcast. This is George Brooks, and we have not talked before, and I've always wanted to have a conversation with you because you're somebody I really look up to. So thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
For anybody that hasn't followed you, I mean, they should be following you on Instagram. Brooks Digi is the handle. Are you just on Instagram or everywhere? Or
I'm pretty much just on Instagram for the most part. I have a YouTube channel too, but it's been a minute since I've uploaded a video.
What you do is it's relatively specialized, but something that a lot of photographers could appreciate, could use more of in their lives. And that is working as a digitech. So any photographers out there that haven't hired one before or worked with one, I'll let you define exactly what you do, but effectively you're making sure all the technical sides of a photo shoot run smoothly. I mean, you'll expand on it more, but you're doing this at a level that is at the absolute peak of the industry. So just, browsing through your Instagram and your webpage, this is work for Netflix and HBO and Apple, Vanity Fair covers, not just shoots inside, the Oscars. Like, these are the most important photos that get taken in America generally. And the photographer needs to know that they're going to turn out, the digital data will be secure. And that leads right into my first question of what do you actually do on set?
Yeah, and it's always a tough one to answer because there's so much that we're doing and in so many different areas. It's kind of hard to wrap it all up into a short, succinct description. But I think really, if you can look at us as like an on-set photo lab, basically. Back in the film days, you'd have your Polaroids, you'd rush your film out to the lab. Maybe you get a roll or two back by lunch to see proofs. But now, in the digital age, that's all happening in real time. So the biggest, first and foremost thing I'm doing on set is making sure that files are organized, named correctly, securely backed up. Everything's in the right place to hand off a drive to the client at the end of the day with all the files, in all the formats that they need them. But in addition to that, I'm also running all the monitors on set. And so I'm the guy that's making sure that everyone can see what they need to see. And then, if any technical issues come up with the camera or any of the computer systems, I'm the one to troubleshoot it. So there's a lot going on. If I'm describing my job to somebody who's in the film industry, I say I'm kind of a combination of a DIT, a VTR, and a first AC all wrapped in one.
Right.
And then, I also like to think of myself as kind of the air traffic controller of the shoot because I'm really the first person and sometimes the only one who's seeing every frame come across the screen. I'm kind of that go-between the client or the art director and the photographer. I'm hearing their notes. I can kind of discreetly relay those to the photographer sometimes before they even stop to have that conversation. So in a lot of ways, you're kind of, I don't want to say you're running the shoot because it's not my shoot, but you're kind of the one that's at the center of all the action, seeing all those different...
You're making sure it runs smoothly.
Yeah, exactly. And on time and efficiently. And yeah, in addition to all those data security things that are, the most important.
Well, and I think it's something that as soon as any photographer working at any level hears that, they're like, that sounds amazing. Why don't I have that on every single shoot that I do?
Totally.
And so, it's something that I wonder about too. Like, generally, we don't have anybody that is dedicated to that role on our shoots. I'm usually the one running around making sure backups are in place and everything's working fine. And it's only been a couple of times we've had that privilege of somebody's completely focused on. But what sort of scale should photographers start thinking about that they could do this? And in a way, I'm kind of asking just about pricing. Like, how hard is it to hire a digitech on a photo shoot?
I think the key is if you have a client on set who wants to be seeing images while you're shooting them, I think having a tech's almost essential. You don't want to necessarily be showing your client the back of your screen all the time. At the very least, I think a lot of photographers who aren't already doing this should look into shooting tethered while they're working and, kind of teching for themselves. But yeah, I mean, a lot of times, like you said, you don't see a tech unless it's a really high budget job. And, the fact of the matter is as your crew gets bigger, it's one more person to pay. A tech's day rate is kind of in line or sometimes slightly higher than hiring a first assistant. And then we're usually renting equipment to the photographer on top of that.
Well, yes, that's another part of how your business is set up that I haven't gone through rental through a tech. Do you kind of just function like a typical rental house would, where photographer needs whatever body you have it? I mean, I know you've got a few different cameras kicking around. So
yeah, at this point, I like to think of myself as kind of a boutique rental house, and equipment rental has become a bigger part of my business. I think that that's something, as a digital tech that you kind of progress along your career, you grow to that. When I was first starting out, I had very little equipment, and a lot of times you're working with photographers who are bringing like their own laptop. They might have a small digital setup that you're using. But once you get to the point where you're doing big jobs more consistently, investing in your kit is a pretty smart thing to do. And at this point, I only would take a job where I can work on my own kit. Everything's kind of tailored to how I like it. I have all the software I need. Really just for efficiency, not having to like set up somebody else's computer for 20 minutes at the beginning of the day is huge. But yeah, that's a big portion of my business, and it's actually like a larger portion of my income at this point than my day rates.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
And I imagine too, like just looking at the behind the scenes that you post, that there's also, it just takes the weight of some of the gear prep off of the creative team, because, it's similar to like a guitar tech at a concert. Like, it's not ideal for a musician to be tuning right before they play a song. If somebody can just hand them a guitar, that's kind of the ideal situation. And I'm sure you spend a lot of your days in between shoots just prepping and maintaining gear and, cleaning lenses or whatever it is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think being able to walk onto set and just have everything kind of ready to go. I know how to set up my kit in such a way that I can have it ready to take a test shot in like 15 minutes. And just knowing that like those monitors come calibrated, I have all the right cables for them. Not the photographer not having to go around and like build that equipment list and source it from a rental house or own, an extra $20,000 or $30,000 worth of equipment.
Like myself, I avoid renting equipment so much because of this. Cause like you rent a lot of rental places, even big ones, like you get equipment that is in rough shape. It hasn't been cleaned in too long. It can be a little, or the menus are set up in the most insane way and there's nobody there to kind of help walk you through them and be ready to like I've been in that situation, scrambling to just get settings back to normal 1 hour before the shoot's supposed to start, and that's not ideal.
Yeah, totally, especially when it comes to the cameras. That's another thing you glossed over, is like owning the cameras. That's something I think comes later in the career, something I've been investing more in recently. But you're right, like having somebody who knows where that camera's been and who the last person that used it was and how it's set up. And, especially as a tech, like owning all these cameras, I get to play with them a lot. And so I'm not necessarily stepping on to a job with a camera I've only worked with once or twice. I don't know the menus. Like at this point, it's great to have somebody that like, if you want to change to a certain autofocus setting or something like that, you don't have to go dive through the menus of a camera you haven't used in 6 months.
Open the manual.
Like, yeah, exactly.
Actually, the one thing that's gotten better is that ChatGPT is a lot faster than actually looking in PDFs, which is how it used to be, is like Googling for the manual,
that's so
scrolling
smart.
to page 27. But it's getting a little better now. But what would be great, I think, for a lot of the audience, I think a lot of people listening right now are aspiring to hire you. They'd love to be able to work with you. But
so.
let's try until they get to that point. Let's talk about some things that they could learn from somebody that is doing, dealing with the technical side full time. And you're just talking about cameras. One thing I'd be curious to know is, what do you see being rented out the most? Like, what are the most common? This actually is not an important question. This is just a curiosity question. What is being used on the biggest shoots these days?
Totally. Yeah. And you're right. It's not the camera that matters. It's the photographer, of course. But when you are delivering, images on a job that's costing a client $500,000 or $1 million, you want to be delivering the best product possible, right? So I think in the advertising world, in entertainment, especially things like key art, film posters, where there's a lot of comping involved, I think everybody's really kind of shifted to medium format. Fuji GFX is what I'm seeing on a really, I don't want to say it's necessarily the majority of what I'm working on is shooting GFX, but a substantial number of like the advertising jobs I'm working on now, that kind of has become the gold standard. And even people who would have been shooting Phase 1 or Hasselblad 5 or 10 years ago, I think have all kind of seen the benefits of the mirrorless system. And also the price point obviously is much more accessible than some of the previous generation medium format systems. So that's a big one. I also see a ton of Canon R5 Mark II now, especially being based in LA. I don't know what it is, but it seems like LA is really kind of a Canon town, whereas a lot of like New York clients I work with are more Nikon shooters.
This is so much of what I want to ask you, is because there's so much skewed information online, because you only get information from the people that post about it. So for example, in my world, I do a lot of YouTube. A lot of YouTubers use Sonys. I think especially because they're a little more hybrid focused. YouTubers are inherently shooting a lot more video. So it can be hard to find that information of what are photographers that are just working and too busy to post on social media actually using.
Yeah, totally. And also I think a good point on that note is that most of the photographers that I'm working with are strictly photographers. There might be video components to the shoots that we're doing, and the photographer might kind of become a director in that moment, but we usually have a separate camera team that's usually shooting like on an Alexa or Red or whatever. So I don't really work with too many people who need that hybrid capability. And we're really looking more at what's the best stills camera out there. And so I definitely do have a few clients who are shooting Sony. A7R Mark V, I think, is a really great camera. I think Sony kind of finally figured out the menus and the autofocus system and everything on that camera. But I think a lot of photographers are even more focused on color. And they just see the camera as a tool, and they're going to pick the one that is going to give them the most, the color that's going to work best for their work versus the ergonomics or the features. I mean, I have a lot of photographers that are still shooting like 5D Mark IV and D850 and haven't even gone mirrorless yet because,
right.
It's familiar to them. They like, again, the color, they have the lenses. So I think that's kind of the biggest thing. I think a lot of professional photographers actually care a lot less about what camera they're using than somebody who's making YouTube videos or a prosumer or me. I care a lot about this stuff, but I again, like GFX and R5 seems to be kind of the most common, but really it just comes down to what the photographer is comfortable with and what's right for the shoot. And sometimes that's not the camera they have. Sometimes they have something where they need to deliver higher resolution and they've never used the GFX 100 before, but that's what they want for this job because they need that extra file size. And then I'm there to help them through it. So
if we're looking at the colors that come out of the raw files from any camera, there's a few different schools. Often you'll hear about people saying, like this brand of colors is the ultimate. Often, Canon gets a great reputation for color, and Fuji. And then there's also just the take, which I kind of often feel this way, that like, look, if you're working with RAW, if you have a professional retoucher, the colors are going to come out the way you decide to have them come out because the flexibility is generally going to be there. How do you and many other of the highest end professional photographers feel about color? Like, is there an opinion coming from the camera that really ends up mattering to the final image?
I think it really depends on the photographer. I mean, I know a couple, especially like fashion shooters, who swear by Nikon. They think, and it's kind of a balance of those two factors, right? Because we're always, again, working in RAW, like you said, we're almost always going to be applying adjustments on set and kind of getting closer to a final look even before post begins. So I'm kind of with you more in that I care a lot more about how a file can be pushed rather than how it comes straight out of camera. But there's definitely some photographers out there, and they tend to be Nikon shooters, it seems, who they like the raw skin tone. They want to see the raw file. They want to see what they're getting in camera, and then all those decisions kind of come later. So everybody's different in that regard.
What part of image quality are cameras still competing in then? I mean, obviously there's different resolutions that you can choose from, but they're all pretty great. Mm-hmm. ISO performance is pretty great across the board. If you were to, like, let's say you started reviewing cameras, which attributes would you actually be looking closely at and say, like, sometimes it's worth choosing this camera because it is better at this and that makes a difference in the final output?
I think that's a really good question in this day and age, because I feel like resolution's not even really a competitive spec anymore. I kind of feel like every camera above, say, 30 or 40 megapixels can produce like a file that can be printed in all the different sizes and formats that the client's going to need. So that's not even a spec I really look at anymore. The biggest thing I would actually look at in resolution is like the resolution versus the sensor size. Because when you have like a 65 megapixel, 35 millimeter camera, that means the individual photo sites are going to be a lot smaller, and your signal to noise ratio is going to be totally different than like a lower resolution camera. So I don't even think resolution is necessarily the spec that matters anymore, unless you're getting in to those really specific client deliverables where they're like, we need to print this 7 feet tall at 600 DPI. And then obviously that's going to be kind of a limiting factor. I tend to look a little bit more, first of all, autofocus, I think, is probably the most important feature after that, that I still think, I think people often assume that, all cameras are mirrorless now. They all have face tracking. They all have great autofocus. And that is true to some extent, but like working with all these different cameras kind of back to back with different people on a daily basis, I have seen some differences in like autofocus speed and accuracy between even models of the same manufacturer. Like take Sony, for example. I thought that the A7R Mark III had pretty poor autofocus performance compared to what, you know, Canon and Fuji was doing at the time. Saw a slight improvement in the 7R4, but I didn't think the face tracking was really there. Like it wouldn't always lock onto faces in the same way that I had come to expect with Canon. Certain, you know, skin tones the camera would not recognize as a person, which I thought was really interesting. And it finally seems like the A7R5 has kind of fixed all those problems and is now on par with, you know, Canon, who I think really does have like the fastest, most accurate autofocus system that I've seen in practice. Because, you know, you can take the perfect picture, and if it's out of focus, client's not gonna be able to use it. And that's a big part of my job, is like checking focus and making sure everything's sharp and like deleting anything that's unusable. So that's definitely one that I focus on. And then I think for me, you know, forever, I've always kind of thought a lot about the ergonomics of the system. You know, what's going to be comfortable in your hand, what camera has the button layout that like feels right to you. So yeah, I think at the end of the day, like every professional camera manufacturer is making more or less like the same product these days. Even the lens lineups between manufacturers, I think, have become like really similar, and they're all great. And so, yeah, I think at this point, it kind of comes down to like what feels comfortable in your hand and brand loyalty, and what do you already, what system are you already bought into, you know?
It's really hard to express the importance of the usability and the ergonomics in reviews a lot of the time. And partly because it's subjective as well. I mean, when something's comfortable, it's hard to adapt, but there also are just some sort of truths to like certain dials, for example, like the way that Sony did its back dial for a long time. I always just found it was too thin and too easy to move, and I would often make mistakes. Details like that, or like, you know, when a button doesn't register presses or accidentally is pressed too often, like this stuff ends up mattering more than almost anything else.
Yeah,
like,
totally.
That's what will cause mistakes. That's what will slow you down. Or when people say like, oh, the autofocus is great as long as you set it up correctly. It's like, well, what, how am I supposed to know what correctly is? So yeah, so often it's like, look, can I just start using this camera and get excellent results that ends up mattering the most? And it's really hard to really talk about that objectively in reviews, I find.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it because it is very subjective, and it comes down to the photographer. And it is often, it's kind of funny sometimes when you're working with somebody who's really familiar with one system, and, you know, for one job, they're using something newer because they need a specific feature, and it really throws them off. Like, you know, not having a button where you're expecting it when you've done that 10,000 times is, I think photography is so much about like the headspace that you're in and the vibe that you're creating on set. And it's like these little problems really can kind of snowball into bigger problems. And yeah, I think you're right. That kind of stuff often gets really overlooked.
Well, before we move away from camera gear, you said all lenses generally are kind of the same right now, but are there any important differences left? Like when you do compare different brands, when do you see, like, is anybody doing it exceptionally well? Is anybody doing it exceptionally badly? Is there anything worth remarking on, or is it all at the pro level? Like if you're buying a good lens from any manufacturer, is there a difference?
Yeah, I don't know if that's something I can necessarily speak to so much, because most of my clients end up using like the highest end lenses available for that system. So when it comes to Canon, I'm pretty much exclusively using L lenses. When it comes to Sony, we're pretty much exclusively using the GM Master Series, whatever they call it. So I don't really, I think a lot of those differences come down more to kind of the different price points of lenses that manufacturers are offering. From what I have seen, I think, you know, all the glass is really exceptional these days. Like I have a couple older RF lenses, non-L, you know, before their equivalent L models came out, like the 35 millimeter. I have a 16 millimeter RF prime, you know, non-L. And the image quality is exceptional. I mean, the sharpness, like focus fall off is all great. So I think then it kind of comes down a little bit more to, again, autofocus. You know, usually the autofocus motor is going to be the first thing that's going to get cut when you're going down the line. And then durability. You know, these are tools you're making money with. And if you're going to be able to get 3 or 4 more years of heavy use out of something that has a little better build quality and it's going to cost you $1,000 more, you know, that might be worth it to you. But again, I think it kind of comes down to personal preference. And
we were in a slightly different era just a few years ago. I mean, in the EF era, in terms of Canon, like there was more distinction between brands, I think, like, but since I mean, while we're talking about Canon, when we went to RF, all of a sudden it's like, wow, even the cheapest RF lenses are often sharper than the most expensive EF lenses I was buying. And I go back and look at photos I shot on my 50 millimeter 1.2, and I'm like, this is terrible. Like this, even at 2.8, like this is not sharp enough. And now the modern 50 is as sharp, wide open as older cameras were at closed down. And so we've really come to a different time in our expectations of what a lens can do. And yeah, like you say, I think from my tests as well, most manufacturers are just there as long as you're buying the best that they offer. And we're just kind of past the point of having to worry about details like, sharpness.
Yeah, totally agree. And I to your point, I think you're right. It all has changed very quickly, like really in the last 5 or 6 years, ever since we kind of made that transition to mirrorless. And I think obviously the electronic technology is progressing really quickly, and like things that the cameras themselves are doing is mind blowing compared to what we had like 5 years ago. But I think maybe it is getting a little overlooked that those same advancements in technology and manufacturing, I think, are applying to optical designs as well. I mean,
do you ever take the like cheaper Chinese lenses for a spin? Like, I don't generally use them. I would just be curious from somebody who is used to the best, like, do these new startup third-party lens manufacturers have something interesting to offer?
Totally. I don't have a ton of them. I have the Viltrox. Is it a Viltrox? I don't know. I have a couple for GFX when that system was new and Fuji didn't have as like complete of a lens lineup. I got like a fisheye and an ultra wide. I've played around with a couple. I haven't done any serious testing with them. The biggest thing that I've seen with those lenses is they seem to have a lot of chromatic aberration compared to like OEM lenses, but it also seems like the last 2 or 3 years have seen a lot of improvement in those products, and I think they're definitely worth checking out, especially if you need something that you're not going to use all the time, like a macro lens or something very specific. I think
weird specialty stuff.
Yeah, I think, and especially the one I do see all the time on the motion side is like the Venus Laowa probe lens.
What I was going to guess.
And those are fantastic. I mean, especially like the second generation of that. I mean, it's kind of crazy. I remember going to a trade show about 10 years ago. I forget which one. And I was surprised by how many like Chinese manufacturers that I had never heard of before had booths. And so it's been kind of crazy to see all those same companies become like huge now. And, as they become more popular, it seems like they're also investing more back into R&D and making those products even better. And yeah, it's gotten very competitive. I think Canon, I'm a little critical of them for this, but I think from a business perspective, they were kind of right to block third-party manufacturers from the RF, autofocus mount, because, that's probably the one thing that's prevented more people from, switching more. And even Sigma deserves an honorable mention too. I think Sigma's been doing some really interesting stuff, for the last decade, but especially in the last few years.
I feel like Sigma was the first one to actually hit this point of like, look, it was like when they relaunched their art series. I think there was a new CEO at that point, and all of a sudden it's like, look, Sigma's not discount anymore. It's all going to be the same quality or better as the first party stuff. And for a while, I feel like Sigma had the best of everything. And that was kind of when everybody started catching up quickly. A question just came to my mind though. So in the cinema world, there's a lot of emphasis on character, whatever exactly that means, which is different from person to person. Like they don't want lenses to be too sterile. They want, that could mean chromatic aberration. That could mean softer corners. That could mean swirly bokeh. It could mean a million different things. I feel like that is a big part of the conversation in the cinema world and not so often in the professional photography world. Is that just me, or are there photographers out there at the high level that are looking for character?
No, I think that's definitely true. And I think there's a few things that go into that. One is that, cinema world is pretty much all PL mount. So those lenses are a lot more interchangeable, and you have a lot more options of what you can realistically use. I think in photo world, most people tend to just kind of accept that they're locked into a certain lens mount, and these are the options available. And I also think in this day and age, the photographers who do care about that are kind of mostly shooting film. And so that becomes a little bit more of a discussion of like, vintage camera systems. And, sometimes there might be a particular Nikon lens that you like, and so you're going to shoot Nikon for that reason. I do work with a couple photographers that will adapt vintage lenses to digital cameras. You see that from time to time. But again, I think it kind of comes down to autofocus for us. Like, if you're a filmmaker who doesn't really do photography, you might kind of overlook the importance of autofocus. But when you're taking single frames, especially in rapid succession with a moving subject, manual focus really just like isn't feasible for us most of the time. And I think you're being maybe like a purist to a fault if you're a photographer who's like, I only shoot in manual focus. I would say that's probably the biggest factor in lens selection. God, I'm talking a lot about autofocus today, but it's true. It's like a really important feature, and it's kind of the one that I see the most people like miss. You can have an incredible photographer. This happens all the time. It's like you have an incredible photographer who has insane concept and casting and wardrobe and the lighting's amazing, and then they don't actually know how to like focus the camera, and it's kind of this running joke between like techs and assistants, like, why aren't I shooting this? But
right, yeah,
again, I and the other thing in film too is like the roles are so separate that you have a DP who like they can focus on that because that's what they're focused on, is like the camera and the lighting. And the photographer is kind of this one-man band who's focused on every department. And, I think if you were to go ask a director, what kind of character do you want in these lenses, he'd probably tell you, yeah, that's a question for the DP. And so I think photographers, and also because we have so much versatility in post to kind of get like the file looking the way that you want it, even more so than you would in film world. I think that's something that only a small portion of photographers are thinking about, who are making work that would be like affected by that choice, if that makes sense.
Well, so moving on to, let's talk about the other side of gear, especially computers. What really matters in terms of computers? So often, when I'm reviewing the latest Mac, I'm talking about it from a photo and video perspective, and I do my tests, but I know you've also tested them quite a bit too. You're obviously pushing them much harder than I do. Like, I'm trying to stress test it the way that I imagine you're using it every single day on set. So what matters about a modern computer? What are you currently using? And how would you spec one if you were to buy one tomorrow?
Sure. Well, as a digital tech, I'm pretty much exclusively working in Capture One. So Capture One performance is the number one thing I care about. And a lot of times that's come down more to like the Capture One side and what the developers are choosing to like leverage in the software. And they've gotten a lot better in the last year about like allowing Capture One to use more resources and be, so it's going to be faster on any computer you have. I also think that the switch from, I'm a Mac user, obviously. I think the switch from Intel to Apple Silicon just kind of, blew everything out of the water. And back in the Intel days, I wouldn't even consider buying anything less than like a maxed out MacBook. Whereas these days I'm recommending M4 Pro to people. I'm recommending, 64 or 48 gigs of RAM to people instead of going the whole 128. I will say I did just buy this week a M4 Max MacBook Pro. I really wanted the anti-glare screen. Nice. And I needed it quickly. And so I bought what was in stock, and it ended up being 128 gigs of RAM, 8 terabyte. Little overkill for what I'm doing for sure.
Oh, shucks.
Yeah. But there's something to be said about having the best.
Yeah, things will catch up to it eventually.
Yeah. The biggest thing for me with like hardware selection these days is I'm running so many monitors that I need something that's going to support at least 3 external monitors. And so that kind of locks me into like the, Max and above series, when we're talking about Apple.
And it's something I've noticed in reviews before too that isn't necessarily printed on the box, is that even though, especially say in MacBook Airs, which you're not necessarily using, but it'll say, supports this number of monitors, and it starts to stress the machine more than, it's at a point that it would matter if you're doing creative work that is like, needs like real-time graphics rendering and stuff. Mm-hmm. The GPU is working harder for every additional display that's plugged in there. So it is nice to have some headroom that like maybe you could plug in one more 8K than you actually are using.
Right. Yeah,
then
totally.
You're not stressing the system.
Yeah, I'm pretty much recommending, I'm on a MacBook Air right now. It's like my email personal computer, but for serious photo work, I'm definitely recommending that photographers stick with a MacBook Pro. I do think, at least in Capture One performance, from what I've tested, the difference between like M1 to M4 is really not even that significant. I think if you're looking to save money, get a higher spec of an older machine versus like a lower spec of a newer machine. But man, I am just so impressed with Apple Silicon and the amazing performance. I mean, like even GFX 100 files render almost instantly on like my M3 and M4 Max, which is, impressive from both Apple and Capture One. Props to them for really speeding up preview rendering. But yeah, I mean, I have a Mac Studio as well that I used to use on like bigger jobs, especially more monitors, or like, if I have to do a lot of processing on set. I don't think I've used it. I was just thinking when the last job I had on it was, I think it was in 2024. Like pretty much everything is on laptop for me now, which is a pretty crazy transition. I was always like Mac Pro in studio person.
Yeah. It wasn't that long ago that you would see a Mac Pro on the carts often. Like that was pretty regular that there'd be like some giant computer being rolled around a studio or something. And now It's like, well, why would you?
What's the point? I mean, my M1 Max MacBook Pro, my first one, like smoked my old Intel, Mac Pro in Capture. I sold it immediately.
There's big advantages too, because you basically have built-in power backup as well. I mean, rolling around a Mac Pro in a studio, like I said, it's plugged into something and it always could become unplugged. And I mean, obviously you've got some workarounds for that, but just having a laptop, all of a sudden it's like, well, power loss is no longer a concern at all. You just don't have to think about it
totally
anymore.
And it gives you an extra screen to work on. Like I like to keep all my utilities and everything on a separate monitor from my main Capture One window, and so there's an extra screen I don't have to carry around too.
All right, screens, that's something I'd love to know more about. So for one thing, like let's start with calibration. What is your take on calibrating monitors? How much time do you spend doing it? How often do you do it? And which monitors are you usually using?
Sure. My take on it these days is that it matters a lot less than it used to. All my calibration 10 or even 5 years ago was trying to conform to like a print standard, because print was still the predominant medium, and we wanted to make sure things were going to look good on paper white. So you'd have like a D50 white point, you'd be calibrating a little darker. Nowadays, if you were to walk on a set with a monitor calibrated that way, your art director or the photographer would probably be like, why is this so yellow? Why is this so dark? Because everything is going to screen now. And a common question I get, I calibrate basically to like an Adobe RGB standard. I'm doing 160 nits, full gamut of the monitor. I use ASOs, but a lot of times somebody will specifically ask, like, what's this going to look like on an iPhone? What's this going to look like on an iPad? And so especially for retouchers or, anybody who's doing post work, I usually recommend, you should have one, reference monitor that's calibrated, whether it's an ASO or a BenQ or, any number of, great color accurate monitors that are out there now. But then I also recommend having your laptop screen open or getting something like a studio display and keeping that on the factory calibration and being able to proof on both. Because, a lot of times, like, I know retouchers who will be working on a calibrated monitor and they send it off to the client and the color gets, sent back because they're looking at it on their MacBook and it just doesn't look right, even though it's technically correct. So,
that's kind of the world I've found, is like all that matters in the end is the iPhone, really. Like it doesn't even matter, because like your MacBook Pro display is also much less standard. There's a lot more iPhones out there in the world.
Yeah, so. And everything's P3 now, so I used to recommend people, have like an sRGB profile they could proof in, but now that's not even going to show you really what it's going to look like on a phone anymore. So I think that's something that everybody kind of collectively has decided doesn't matter as much anymore, and I get a lot less questions about it on set than I used to. And I think a lot of that is just kind of being looked at in post now. I'm always just looking at the files and making sure that like we have good information in the shadows, highlights aren't clipping. Because again, I mean, so much of that fine detail work is going to happen after we leave the shoot. Just giving them the best file possible, I think, is more important than like, is this monitor too red on set? But I still calibrate. I calibrate all my monitors in like under control. I used to do it every day. I used to get into the studio and like calibrate under the studio lighting conditions, and it was like a part of my setup routine. And as that became less and less critical, now I do it like every 6 months or so, every 1,000 hours on a monitor, under very controlled conditions in my shop.
Since you work with the proest of the pros. Help me answer a comment that I get all the time, especially in my iPhone reviews, is professionals don't use an iPhone. Usually in reference to like I'm testing the camera, I'm like showing what photos look like. I'm just talking about the photography or video experience of using an iPhone. Generally, like my response is photographers still have a phone at all times, and it's part of the workflow in one way or another. How do you see phones getting used on set? And like, is the iPhone often a big part of it, or how does this integrate?
Well, I mean, the best camera is the one you have with you, right? So this is my only like personal camera. I think most photographers would agree that unless they're a real enthusiast outside of work, they're probably not carrying like an X100 or something around with them every day. So I think a phone's an incredibly important tool for a photographer. I mean, the biggest way you probably see them used, which is like every job, is, you know, scout photos, wardrobe approvals. Like we're always kind of taking reference photos, lighting reference, you know, set design, like just to show somebody something. That's happening all the time. In terms and it's kind of annoying because, you know, sometimes when you're working on something really high profile or secretive, they like tape your phone camera. And that's when you really realize how much of a tool that is for you all day when you can't use it. And it's like, oh my God, I use my phone camera all the time on set to like show people things. In terms of like actual deliverables to clients that are shot on iPhone, definitely seeing a lot more of that in the last couple of years. You know, in the past, if there's like an element of something that has like a selfie in it, like just as a real world example, I did a ad shoot for WhatsApp last year. And we had celebrity talent who was like in a hero frame, and then within the frame they were taking a selfie, and then there was kind of like an overlay of the text chain that they were in, and like there was a selfie, and we shot the actual selfies like on iPhone. They looked like selfies. And then I've got a couple of, it didn't end up happening, but I was supposed to do like a photo booth kind of event at like an FYC event recently that Apple was putting on for Apple TV. And they seem to be really the client that wants everything shot on iPhone. Not everything, you know, if we're doing like a bigger, you know, you can't really talk too much about Apple stuff, but
but there's a few. I have seen a couple campaign related shoots like that typically in the past would have been shot on. I mean, this is me from the outside. I don't have insider knowledge, but that would have traditionally been shot on a bigger camera, and to me look like there have been some examples of iPhones being used when they wouldn't have in the past. And again, Apple does this more than anyone else for obvious reasons. But.
Yeah, and I think it's still a little bit of a novelty in that way where like you're shooting something on iPhone because you want to like advertise the fact that it's shot on iPhone and be authentic. I don't know if that's going to continue being true. I mean, I think so many
weird
brands,
how long that's been a thing.
Yeah. And especially now that you can actually tether an iPhone in Capture One and shoot live, I think that opens up a lot of like possibilities for that in the future. And I do get more requests for it than I did a few years ago. You know, Photo has an app where you can sync strobes to your iPhone now. So like the tools, I think once those tools are more in place and like you can use an iPhone like an actual camera in a studio environment, the reasons not to use it will be fewer. For now, sure. But I also see such a shift towards like UGC, user generated content with brands, which like brands are way more inclined to use something that like one of their customers shot than spend $50,000 on a photo shoot for that product, because it also gets more engagement. And I think like people online want, you know, something that feels real. And I think as more brands try and push that and perhaps like shoot more in a way that mimics that, even if it is like a, you know, controlled environment with a professional photographer, I think in the next few years we're going to see a lot more like professional work done on mobile for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I've talked about this a few times, but that's been a lot of our professional video work lately is social, that needs to like social campaigns basically. And it's, you know, just being, it's only going to run on the social platforms. It's never going to be on TV. So it's all vertical. And we always are pushing the clients that, you know, they don't have an opinion about the camera really, but we come in saying like, no, this has to be shot on iPhone, like, right. Or on a phone. You know, it does not make any sense. If the background blurs out, I'm going to swipe past it. Like it has to look like this is shot by the user, because as you're flipping through TikTok, you're looking for any excuse to get past an ad. Like, you don't want to stay on the ad. So the sooner you can tell it's an ad, the sooner you're going to swipe away.
I've seen a couple really good TikTok ads lately that don't feel at all like an ad. And it's not till like 20 seconds into it that you see the little sponsored flag, I do think that applies a lot more to video world than stills world. Yeah. Like, I think there's so many more situations where A, you can get away with shooting video on iPhone, and B, it makes more sense to do so than in stills world where, like I said, like a lot of the professional features in the camera are still lacking. But like, even before I got on with you, I was watching one of my favorite shows on YouTube. It's called Jet Lag, the game, and it's like kind of a amazing race style, like DIY travel competition show. And they shoot it all on iPhone because it's all self-shot, and what else would they shoot it on? Like, that's the only camera that makes sense to shoot something like that. Shout out to those guys. It's an awesome show. They just won a Webby. But yeah, I mean, I think video was kind of the first to move in that direction. And I know we're going to see photos start shifting that way soon too.
One thing I think we could all do better at is backup. It's a big part of what you do. Can you give any big picture tips on what we should all be thinking about while we're shooting? What are sort of the minimums? What do you see as common mistakes for people that don't have a tech on set with them? Help me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's always a tough question to answer because everybody's workflow is going to be slightly different depending on how they're working. And I do a decent amount of consulting work, like going into photographers' studios and organizing their archives and setting up like long-term archival backup solutions for them. Every single one of those looks very different depending on the volume of work and what type of projects they are and all that. So I can't necessarily give you a solution that's going to work for everybody, but some like general guidelines that I always like to keep in mind with backups is, first and foremost, one is none. If you've offloaded your memory card onto your laptop, and let's say there are only 2 copies on the card and on the computer. Let's say the memory card was corrupted, and those files that you imported to the computer are also corrupted. Well, you don't have any duplicate copy of that. So if I'm on a job and the client only has one hard drive for me, I always keep a second drive in my kit that I'm going to be backing up separately, so that we always have 2 copies in case anything happens to the first 2.
Well, and just to even double down on that, what you're saying is also that it's not that you were just making a second copy backup, but in real time, as the images are being captured, there are 2 images immediately. Like, there's not a big delay.
Yeah, there's
like, tomorrow you'll back it up.
Right, definitely close to real time as possible. Yeah. I think Capture One just added a like auto backup feature where you theoretically could like immediately back up every frame as it's captured. They also have a new feature where you can like write to card in the camera while it's tethered, so you can at least do that.
I thought it was so weird how long it took for that to happen.
Yeah, it's kind of they had to work with the manufacturers on that one a little bit because it's part of like the PTP protocols for each different camera, whether or not that's possible, but it is a good feature. Right. It's also, I will say, one of the first troubleshooting steps if your camera won't tether is to take the card out. So it doesn't always work, but that's like a good first line of defense if you're shooting tethered. If you're shooting with a camera that will write to 2 cards simultaneously, I usually recommend that. But backing up does slow things down. Like if you're writing to 2 cards instead of 1, your burst speed is often reduced. And so like there's all these factors that kind of go into how quickly are you doing it. I back up manually. I use an app called ChronoSync to do all of my backups. There's a lot of options out there. That one, for better or for worse, is kind of the industry standard in photo.
Yeah, that's what I've always used.
And it's great. But I like to do it manually. I like to kind of have control over when those backups are happening. So if the photographer's shooting like a 20 frame per second burst, I'm not running a backup at the same time because that would mean we can't like see that burst coming in as fast. But I'm always like command tabbing between Capture One and ChronoSync, and basically anytime I have like even a 1 minute break on set, I'll usually run my backups, and that's just kind of become second nature to me. But yeah, the biggest one is like 2 copies of everything. Do it as quickly as possible. I know it's not always like realistic, but the number of times I've heard somebody like, shoot to 1 card for a whole day and then like not import it that night, and then they get their camera stolen, or like they lose the card. It's like that stuff's real. So, yeah, those are kind of my two big tips, I would say. I'm trying to think if there's anything else.
I mean, yeah, like honestly, the most basic stuff is probably the most important because it's many of us are not even meeting that on a regular basis.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think like I usually recommend, if we want to go a little deeper, I usually recommend that people kind of separate like their long-term storage from their like files that they need immediately. So I'm usually recommending most photographers have a like slower, cheaper, larger, archival setup, whether that's like an NAS RAID system, or for me, I use like a dual drive dock and just like bare drives. That's like the cheapest per gigabyte solution. And then, being diligent about clearing off your working drive as projects are finished, putting them onto the long-term storage, especially if you're traveling a lot. Like you don't want to be traveling with your backup drive all the time, and that's your only copy.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Well, wait, but I want to back. You said something that I went down this rabbit hole the other day, and I'd love to know what you think about it. If you Google, which I kind of forget the exact number, but if you search for like what's the lifespan of an average hard drive, like spinning disk hard drive, the answer is something like 5 years. I think it's like 5 to 10 years. And
yeah, I always think of 10, but I know it.
That does not seem right to me, actually, because I was thinking about it. I'm like, you know what? I have tons of spinning disks that are 15 years old. Yeah. And, I've only had anything fail when it was like kind of newer. Like it was more like, I haven't had anything like age out yet. It's not, and I'm just wondering, and when I posted about this, like this is just, kind of surveying Twitter, kind of everybody that responded were like, yeah, me too. Like I don't find this kind of arbitrary 10 years. I'll search for it while you answer. But yeah, no, I don't know. How do you feel about that?
I think I always hear like 10 years for spinning disks. I think that's kind of the conventional wisdom. You also, hear that you need to be plugging those drives in and turning them on regularly, or the what I've heard is that like the grease in the bearing of the spinning disc will freeze up and then the disc won't spin anymore. Or I forget if it's like either the Earth's magnetic field or like gamma radiation over time will cause the binary data on the drive to become corrupted. And then of course the other argument for that is like as operating systems get newer and newer and technology improves, like you're basically the thing that's carrying the data will become obsolete over time. Like I think there's so many different arguments for that. I'm with you though. I have drives that are probably 15 years old, some maybe even older, that I'm not looking at regularly, and they seem to always work whenever I go to plug them in. Like the biggest failures I've had have been with things like an external hard drive's power supply failing, and like you can extract the drive and the drive is still fine.
The data's still there.
So obviously I think it is a good idea to be thinking about migrating your archive every 5 to 10 years to something newer. You're probably going to need more storage anyways. So,
I'm looking at Backblaze's study about that. Like they have an article detailing this. If anybody knows,
the best for that stuff.
Yep. But they're saying 6 years and 9 months, and the like Google AI answer is 3 to 5 years.
That's crazy.
And it's like, that's crazy. That's not true.
That's a conspiracy to sell hard drives, I think.
It really is. Like, I mean, we should all be more careful. Like, we should be very careful and assume the worst. But, I don't know. That doesn't seem right to me.
A big one that I did get into a couple weeks ago with another tech, though, is the argument against long-term storage on SSDs. And I think that one is a little bit more real. Again, I'm going to botch the explanation on this. But basically, if you don't plug in an SSD for 10 years, and you're not supplying current to the board in there, eventually the data can, vanish because it doesn't have that like micro current that it needs to stay on the drive. I'm sorry to all the tech people out there who know the mechanics of that. That was like the worst explanation ever. But I do think that holds a little bit more true in that you should be doing long-term archival storage on spinning disks rather than SSDs, and sticking with the SSDs for like your fast working drives.
It's also cheaper, so
yeah,
it's totally pretty easy for most people to default to that. There was another all my questions are gear, but I mean,
I love talking gear. It's a big part of the job.
Do you have any like great accessory recommendations that might be a little that like maybe I don't have in my bag right now? Like, is there anything like, we've all got gaffer's tape, but sure. What should I add that maybe is not there?
I was kind of racking my brain on this question before we got on, because a few years ago I probably could have like whipped out some crazy thing in my kit that I thought was cool and probably didn't use that much. And the more I work,
Gary Fong flash modifier.
Yeah, or like I used to carry like a Klein digital level, so I could, if we had a camera set up on tripod, I could get the exact angle of the camera to like get back to that point. And I don't know, I think I've really stripped down my kit a lot in recent years, especially now that I've had like over a decade of experience doing this. I kind of know what I'm going to need every day, what I'm going to need like once a month, and what I can leave at home. So I don't really have anything too crazy in my kit, but something I've gotten on recently that I love are these. I have an example right here. I love these small rig VB99 Pro V-mount batteries.
Yes.
You probably have some of these, but like
I have a stack of them.
I've been using V-mount solutions to power my laptops on location for like since like 2017 at this point. I was like core SWX fam for the longest time. And I kind of needed something I could rent out to people that had a built-in USB-C power delivery, so I didn't have to give them a whole plate, and like they're just easier. And so I got some of these to fill that purpose. It took years, I think, for the like 100-watt power delivery batteries to really catch up. I tried so many over the years I wasn't satisfied with. These are the first ones I've had that I think like hit all the check boxes, because I use these on travel jobs because I carry just a regular USB-C PD charger for them instead of a big quad V-mount charger.
I mean, that's one of the most important things about it. Like I will not buy another battery that is not chargeable by USB-C.
Totally. I'm kind of transitioning to that too. And like, even if you're shooting a stills camera that is not like V-mount powered, having something like this that can run your laptop for a few hours, charge your phone. Like I run all my wireless video transmitters off the DTAP on this. Like, these are just kind of my power Swiss Army knife on set. I'm trying to think like what other cool stuff. Oh,
I mean, you've got a lot of tech, so.
Yeah. Another one I love, which is a little bit more of a niche one. There's several companies that make these now. I don't have one right here, but maybe you've seen the like camera holster donuts that people are using now. My buddy Brian Faney, who's another tech in LA, I'm going to credit him with like making the first one of those. And I think like many other things he's made, he's been like copied now. But that has become such an awesome piece of kit. Like for years, it was like, where do you put the camera down when you're not shooting? We'd have Apple boxes. Sometimes you'd have like a whole separate camera cart, or like a sandbag on the floor, or that little hammock I put in my tripod. I've put cameras in there that have dropped before, So
right. A little thing for me is like if you got an Arca Swiss plate on the bottom and it just doesn't sit flat anymore. Like this doesn't actually matter, but I don't like putting my camera down and it tips over.
Totally.
Or the lens.
We're all like aesthetically driven people with OCD, right? Yeah. But yeah, that donut's been awesome, and it's just like super secure. Camera's always there. It's not going to get knocked over. It's not going to get scuffed. And then also on my like laptop tripod rig that I bring around on location, it kind of doubles as like a handle for the whole rig. So that's like a really small piece of kit that's become really life-changing for like me specifically as a digital tech.
Well, wait, and did we say what they do? I think you said, have I seen them? But the whole point is just that it's like, describe how it.
Oh yeah, right.
Because what this object is.
Some people will only be listening to this, right? So
yes.
It's basically, it looks like a donut. It's a metal or 3D printed plastic ring that's wrapped in something soft, either like silicone molded or like bike handlebar tape. And then it attaches onto a Mayfer clamp or super clamp. And you can clamp it on a light stand, you can clamp it on a monitor stand, and you drop the lens of the camera into the middle of the hole. And it will just like really securely keep your camera off the ground, out of the way when you're not using it, without having to fuss with like a tripod plate or something like that.
Are there any... So, I mean, cables are a big part of your life, obviously.
Very much so.
I'm sure half your job is is making sure that they're connected correctly and running as they should. What are your preferences in terms of data and power delivery? Is there a particular brand? Is there something you look out for? How do you choose the cables you're going to use on set?
Well, most of that comes down to tether cables for me. I am a big Area 51 TetherCo fan. I will say I'm a little biased because I'm friends with Scott, who owns that company, and for a long time those were like the only tether cables you could buy that weren't tether tools. Tether tools cables seem to have come a long way in the last few years. I don't own any right now, but I have.
It seemed like they didn't change forever.
Yeah, and they were not good before. I don't know. Don't sue me for slander, but they were unreliable before. I used to have like kind of a deal with them, and I got a huge batch of cables that all stopped working within a month, and that's when I kind of started looking for other options. Their new stuff seems good, but I love Area 51. They're a very small company, and it's one guy and his wife running it, so they don't have the best customer service sometimes. I will be very honest about that, but they make a really good product. And then the other one that's very similar, that's LA based, is a company called Luna, spelled LVNA, and they make really high quality, durable tether cables, similar designs, every cam manufacturer, every port they offer. And there's several of these like tether cable companies that have all kind of sprung up in recent years. I'm convinced they all use the same factories. They're all more or less the same product. It's like buy the one that's locally available to you at the best price.
Nice.
But that's a big one. In terms of like data cables and that kind of stuff, I usually just stick with first party OEM when possible. So like, almost every hard drive I use on set, the Samsung T7, I have a huge collection of the cables that come in the boxes with those. They're great. Power cables, I use Apple. I like Anker as a brand a lot. I have a lot of Anker products. If I need something that like is a little bit more unique or, custom design or like a longer version of something, that's usually the first brand that I would look to.
Nice. Well, I mean, there's a million things I could ask you about. And if listeners have any more questions, want to know more about this stuff, they should already be following you on Instagram. Again, it's BrooksDigi. And I appreciate the content you make. I love it when you test things out. I love when you give us your very unique perspective, because not many people are doing the kind of work that you are. And so there's an expertise that you've been honing over the years that a lot of us aspire to. So
thank you.
Thanks for sharing it.
Yeah, it's a fun niche. And I do hope to be making some more like YouTube content and starting to do more reviews and stuff again soon. It's just, as you probably know, that becomes a full-time job essentially.
That's the thing you do.
And I kind of have decided that I love my actual job and working on set, and that stuff has had to take a little bit of a backseat the last year or so.
Yeah,
but,
I get it. Well, thanks for coming on and sharing it here.
Thanks for having me. This is a lot of fun.